I'm sitting in the parking lot of Sunset Manor Assisted Living, staring at the brochure in my trembling hands. The glossy pages showcase smiling elderly residents playing chess and tending gardens, but all I can see are the words my son Marcus spoke to me 3 hours ago, echoing in my mind like a death sentence. Mom, you're becoming a burden we can't handle anymore. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The engine of my 15-year-old Honda Civic ticks as it cools, the only sound breaking the suffocating silence. Through the windshield, I watch other families walking their loved ones through the facility's entrance, and I wonder if any of those adult children used the word burden when they made this decision. The leather portfolio sitting beside me contains documents that could change everything, but Marcus doesn't know they exist. Nobody does. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and until this morning I believed I was living the quiet, unremarkable life of a 73-year-old widow. Modest pension, small house in Riverside, California, and the occasional struggle to keep up with rising grocery prices. My son sees an aging woman who can't quite manage her medications properly, who forgets to lock her front door sometimes, who needs help reaching items on high shelves. What he doesn't see is the woman who spent 40 years carefully building something extraordinary while everyone assumed she was just getting by. But sometimes the greatest secrets are hidden in plain sight, and sometimes the people who love us the most are the ones who see us the least clearly. The morning started like any other Tuesday in my small house on Maple Street. I was in my kitchen at 6:30 grinding coffee beans in the same electric grinder I'd used for 12 years when I heard Marcus's key in the front door. The sound made my heart sink rather than lift, because unexpected visits from my son had become synonymous with lectures about my declining independence. "Mom?" he called out, his voice carrying that particular tone of forced patience that had become our normal mode of communication. "We need to talk." I continued preparing my coffee, taking comfort in the familiar ritual. French press, water heated to exactly the right temperature, 4 minutes of steeping time. These small consistencies had become anchors in a life that everyone else seemed determined to reorganize for my own good. Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing his usual uniform of pressed khakis and a polo shirt from the real estate office where he worked as a sales associate. At 45, he had inherited his father's earnest face and tendency toward premature worry lines, but none of Richard's patience or gentle humor. Marcus had always been the type of child who colored inside the lines and grew into an adult who believed there was a right way to do everything. "Good morning, sweetheart," I said, not turning around from my coffee preparation. "You're here early. Did you eat breakfast? I have some of that multigrain bread you like." "Mom, sit down," he said, and something in his tone made me finally face him. "Jesse and I have been talking, and we think it's time to have a serious conversation about your living situation." I poured my coffee into the blue ceramic mug that Richard had given me for our 20th wedding anniversary, the one with tiny chips around the rim that I refused to replace. "What about my living situation?" Marcus pulled out one of my kitchen chairs and sat down heavily, like a man preparing to deliver bad news to a terminal patient. "You're 73 years old, Mom. Living alone in this house isn't safe anymore." "I've been living in this house for 38 years, I replied, settling into my own chair across from him. "I think I've figured out how to manage it by now." "Have you?" His voice took on the edge of frustration that had become increasingly common in our conversations. "Because Mrs. Patterson next door called me yesterday, she said she found you wandering around your backyard at midnight last week, looking confused." The memory came back to me clearly. I had been restless, unable to sleep, and had gone outside to check on my herb garden. Mrs. Patterson, who seemed to monitor the neighborhood with the dedication of a security guard, had spotted me through her kitchen window and immediately assumed something was wrong. Rather than simply asking if I was okay, she had called Marcus with her concerns. "I wasn't confused," I said quietly. "I was checking on my basil plants. There had been a frost warning." "At midnight?" Marcus leaned forward, his expression a mixture of concern and exasperation. "Mom, that's not normal behavior." "And what about last month when you forgot to lock your front door? Anyone could have walked right in." "I forgot once," I said. In 38 years of living here, I forgot to lock my door once. It only takes once, he replied, his voice rising slightly. And what about your medications? I found 3 different pill bottles in your purse last week, and you couldn't remember what any of them were for. This was partially true. I had been carrying extra medication bottles because I was sorting them for Mrs. Chen down the street, who had been struggling with her own organization since her husband passed away. But explaining this to Marcus would only reinforce his belief that I was taking on responsibilities I couldn't handle. Marcus, I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable, I understand that you're worried about me, but I'm managing just fine. I pay my bills on time, I keep my house clean, I drive safely, and I have good relationships with my neighbors. Managing just fine. He pulled out his phone and started scrolling through what appeared to be a list. Mom, you've called me 14 times in the past month. 14 times. Usually for things like not being able to figure out your cable remote or needing help changing a light bulb. I call you because you're my son, I said. Because I thought you enjoyed helping your mother occasionally. It's not occasional anymore, Mom. It's constant. Jesse and I can't go out to dinner without wondering if you're going to call, because you can't remember how to work the microwave. We can't take a weekend trip without arranging for someone to check on you. It's affecting our marriage, our work, our entire life. The word he hadn't said yet hung in the air between us like a sword waiting to fall. I could see him building up to it, gathering his courage to speak the truth he'd been dancing around for months. What are you saying, Marcus? I asked, though I already knew. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder filled with brochures and printouts. Jesse and I have been researching senior living communities, places where you'd have your own apartment, but also have help available when you need it. Meal plans, housekeeping, transportation, medical support. I picked up one of the brochures, noting the cheerful photographs of elderly people engaged in various activities. The prices listed on the back page made my stomach clench, not because I couldn't afford them, but because of what they represented. You want to put me in a nursing home, I said. It's not a nursing home, Mom, it's assisted living. There's a big difference. You'd have your independence, but also the security of knowing help is available 24 hours a day. I flipped through more brochures, each one featuring the same carefully staged scenes of contented seniors. And you've already looked into this without discussing it with me? Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. We wanted to have options to present to you. We didn't want to worry you unnecessarily if we couldn't find anything suitable. How considerate of you to manage my emotions for me. Mom, don't be like that. We're trying to do what's best for everyone here. Everyone? Yes, everyone. You, me, Jesse, even the grandkids. They're starting to notice that Grammy needs help with everything, and it's confusing for them. I set down the brochures and looked directly at my son.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Man I had raised from infancy, whose scraped knees I had bandaged, and whose fears I had soothed through countless nightmares. Marcus, what exactly are you asking me to do? He took a deep breath, and I could see him steeling himself for what came next. We think you should visit a few of these places, maybe do a trial stay at 1 or 2 of them. See how you feel about the idea of moving somewhere with more support. And if I don't feel good about the idea. Mom, he said, his voice taking on the tone adults use with stubborn children. You're becoming a burden we can't handle anymore. The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were spoken in anger or cruelty, but because they were delivered with such matter-of-fact resignation. Marcus truly believed that his 73-year-old mother had become nothing more than an obligation that was interfering with his real life. A burden, I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't mean it harshly, Mom. But yes, the constant phone calls, the worry, the responsibility of checking on you all the time. Jesse and I are exhausted. We're in our 40s, we're trying to manage our own careers and raise our kids, and we can't keep being your primary caregivers. I stood up slowly, my coffee cup still warm in my hands. I see. Do you? Because I don't think you realize how much we've been doing for you. How much it's affecting our lives. I walked to my kitchen window and looked out at the backyard where Richard and I had planted our first garden 40 years ago. The maple tree we had put in when Marcus was born now towered over the fence, its branches heavy with autumn leaves. "When did I become such a problem for you, Marcus?" "Mom, you're not a problem. You're just getting older, and older people need more help. It's not your fault, but it's reality." I turned back to face him, noting how young he still looked despite his complaints about exhaustion and responsibility. "And you've decided that the solution is to move me somewhere else so I can become someone else's burden. That's not how I would put it. How would you put it?" Marcus rubbed his forehead, a gesture I recognized from his childhood when he was frustrated by math homework or trying to explain why he hadn't cleaned his room. "I would say that we're trying to find a solution that gives you the care you need while allowing Jesse and me to have our lives back." "Your lives back," I repeated. "I wasn't aware I had taken them away. You know what I mean, Mom. We want to know that you're safe and taken care of, but we also want to be able to go away for a weekend without worrying about you. We want to be able to turn off our phones during dinner without wondering if you're having an emergency." I sat back down at the kitchen table and picked up the brochure for Sunset Manor. The monthly fees started at $4,000, more than double my visible pension income. "Marcus, have you thought about how I would pay for one of these places?" "We've looked into it. Your pension plus Social Security should cover most of the basic costs. And there are programs to help with the rest." "Welfare," I said. "Financial assistance," he corrected. "It's not welfare, Mom. It's making sure you get the care you need." I nodded slowly, processing not just his words but the assumptions behind them. Marcus believed his mother was a 73-year-old woman living on a fixed income who would need financial assistance to afford basic care. He had no idea that the modest lifestyle I maintained was a choice rather than a necessity. "What if I said no?" I asked. "What if I told you I wanted to stay in my own home and continue living independently?" Marcus's expression hardened slightly. "Then we'd have to talk about other options." "Such as?" "Such as the fact that Jesse and I can't continue to be responsible for your well-being if you're not willing to make reasonable accommodations for your age and situation." "You're threatening to abandon me." "I'm telling you that we can't keep living this way. Something has to change, Mom. Either you make the change, or we'll have to make it for you." The silence that followed was heavy with 30 years of unspoken resentments and misunderstandings. I looked at this man who had once been my baby, my toddler, my young son who came to me with every hurt and disappointment, and realized that somewhere along the way he had stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a problem to be solved. "I need some time to think about this," I said finally. "How much time?" "A few days. A week, maybe." Marcus gathered up his brochures and stood to leave. "Mom, I don't want you to think we're trying to get rid of you. We love you, and we want what's best for you. But this situation isn't working for anyone anymore." After he left, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at my reflection in the window as the morning light shifted across the glass. The woman looking back at me had short gray hair that I cut myself to save money, laugh lines around eyes that had seen 73 years of life, and hands that showed the wear of decades spent taking care of everyone else before myself. But that woman was not the whole story. That woman was the carefully constructed image I had maintained for so long that even I sometimes forgot it was only part of who I really was. I walked to my bedroom and opened the closet door, pushing aside the modest clothes that filled the front of the space. Behind them, in a file box that looked unremarkable among the seasonal decorations and old photo albums, were the documents that told a very different story about Eleanor Whitmore. The first folder contained statements from investment accounts that Marcus had never heard of. The second held documentation of real estate holdings in 3 different states. The third contained business partnership agreements and profit-sharing documents from ventures that had quietly generated income for nearly 4 decades. I pulled out the most recent portfolio summary and stared at the number printed at the bottom of the page. $5.2 million. Not including the house, which was worth considerably more than the modest neighborhood suggested. thanks to renovations I had funded through carefully laundered investment income over the years. For 40 years, while everyone assumed I was just getting by on Richard's pension and my part-time job at the library, I had been building something extraordinary. It had started small, with a few $100s invested in a technology stock that everyone said was too risky. When that investment paid off dramatically, I had been smart enough not to spend the windfall, but to reinvest it. Again and again, through decades of careful research and calculated risks, always keeping my activities invisible to friends and family, who would have had opinions about how a librarian and her construction worker husband should manage their money. Richard had known, of course. He had been my partner in the early days, though he'd never shared my instinct for financial strategy. "You have a gift for this, Ellie," he used to say, watching me research companies and analyze market trends at our kitchen table after dinner. "You see things other people miss." After he died 8 years ago, I had maintained the modest lifestyle we had always presented to the world, partly because I genuinely enjoyed the simplicity of it, but mostly because I had learned that people treated you differently when they knew you had money. They expected things from you. They made assumptions about what you should do with your resources. They stopped seeing you as a person and started seeing you as a solution to their own problems. So I had continued driving my old Honda, shopping at discount stores, and carefully monitoring my spending in public while my investments continued to grow. I lived in the same house, wore the same kinds of clothes, and maintained the same friendships I had always had. The only difference was that I no longer worried about money. Ever. But, sitting in my kitchen after Marcus's visit, I realized that my carefully maintained secret had become a prison of sorts. My son saw me as a burden because he believed I was a synonymous burden. He thought I needed his help because he assumed I had no other options. His frustration and resentment were based on a complete misunderstanding of who I actually was and what I was actually capable of. The irony was bitter. I had spent decades hiding my success to avoid becoming an obligation to my family, only to find that the hiding itself had made me exactly that. I picked up my phone and called Sunset Manor to schedule a tour, not because I had any intention of moving there, but because I needed to understand exactly what Marcus thought he was offering me. I needed to see firsthand what he believed was the appropriate solution for his burden of a mother. The woman who answered the phone was professionally cheerful. "Mrs. Whitmore, your son called yesterday to inquire about our services. I'm so glad you're interested in seeing our facility. Would tomorrow afternoon work for you?" Tomorrow afternoon would work perfectly, because by then, I would have decided how to handle the most important conversation of my life. The conversation where I would finally show Marcus who his mother really was. But first I had some research to do. I spent the rest of Tuesday afternoon doing something I hadn't done in years. I let myself imagine what $5 million could buy. Not just for me, but for Marcus and his family. College funds for my grandchildren that would eliminate any financial stress about their education. A house for Marcus and Jesse in the neighborhood they had always talked about but couldn't afford on his real estate commissions. Travel, opportunities, security, freedom from the very financial pressures that made him see his aging mother as a burden rather than a person. But I also spent time imagining what that money could buy for other people. The library where I had worked for 25 years was constantly struggling with budget cuts. The senior center where I volunteered was operating with equipment from the 1980s. Mrs. Chen, who was struggling to afford her medications on her late husband's pension, had been eating less to stretch her grocery budget. Money was power, I had learned over the decades. But it was also responsibility. And after 40 years of keeping my financial life secret, I wasn't sure I was ready for the responsibility that would come with revealing it. That evening, I called my financial advisor, Margaret Walsh, a woman I had been working with for 15 years, and who was one of only 3 people who knew the full extent of my assets. "Eleanor." Margaret's voice was warm and familiar. "I was just thinking about you. The quarterly reports are ready, and I think you'll be pleased with the performance of your tech holdings." "Margaret," I said, "I need to ask you a hypothetical question. Of course. If someone wanted to remain anonymous while making substantial charitable donations, what would be the best way to structure that? How substantial are we talking about?" 7 figures. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Eleanor, Is everything all right? This is quite a change from your usual approach to your wealth. I had always been conservative with my money, taking calculated risks with investments, but never making large expenditures or donations. My approach had been to build and preserve wealth, rather than spend it, partly because I enjoyed the challenge of growing my portfolio, and partly because I had never been entirely sure what I wanted to do with the money. My son thinks I'm a burden, I said. He wants to put me in assisted living because he believes I can't take care of myself financially or otherwise. And you're considering revealing your assets to him? I'm considering a lot of things. Margaret sighed. Eleanor, in 15 years of working with you, I've watched you build something remarkable while living like a woman with 1/10 of your actual net worth. You've been incredibly disciplined about maintaining your privacy, and I've always respected that choice. But I've also wondered if you were ever going to allow yourself to actually enjoy what you've built. I do enjoy it, I said. I enjoy the security of knowing I'll never be dependent on anyone. I enjoy the freedom of knowing I have options. But do you really have options if no one knows you have them? It was a question I hadn't considered before. What good was financial independence if everyone around you treated you like you were financially dependent? What was the point of having choices if everyone assumed you had none? Margaret, I said, if I decided to make some significant changes in how I handle my assets, how quickly could that be arranged? What kind of changes? The kind that would make it impossible to keep things secret anymore. The next morning, I dressed more carefully than usual for my appointment at Sunset Manor. Not because I was trying to impress anyone, but because I wanted to see the facility through the eyes of someone who genuinely needed to be there, versus someone who was being pressured into it by family members who saw her as a burden. The drive to Sunset Manor took me through neighborhoods I rarely visited, areas where large houses sat on manicured lots behind iron gates. I thought about the assumptions people made about wealth and age, about dignity and independence, about who deserved respect, and who deserved pity. The facility itself was exactly what the brochures had promised. Clean, well-lit, staffed by people who spoke to residents with the kind of professional kindness that managed to be both caring and slightly condescending. My tour guide, a woman named Patricia who couldn't have been older than 30, showed me studios and one-bedroom apartments that were pleasant and safe and utterly devoid of personality. We find that our residents really appreciate the peace of mind that comes with knowing help is always available, Patricia said as we walked through a common area where several elderly people sat watching television. Family members especially love knowing their loved ones are in good hands. What about residents who don't actually need much help? I asked. People who are here more for family peace of mind than personal necessity? Patricia's smile became slightly more genuine. We see that sometimes. Adult children who worry more than they need to. But usually residents find that they enjoy the social aspects of community living, even if they don't need the care services. I looked around at the residents in the common area. Some were clearly engaged and alert, chatting with friends or working on puzzles. Others seemed lost in their own worlds, staring blankly at the television or sleeping in their chairs. I wondered which category Marcus imagined I would fit into. The monthly fees, I said. I noticed they vary quite a bit depending on the level of care. Yes, we have several tiers. Basic independent living starts at $4,000 a month, but most of our residents end up needing at least some additional services. The average monthly cost for our residents is closer to $6,000. $6,000 a month, $72,000 a year. In 10 years, the cost of keeping me at Sunset Manor would exceed what Marcus believed was my entire net worth. And what happens if residents can't afford the increasing costs as they need more care? Patricia's expression became uncomfortable. We work with families to explore all available options. There are state programs that can help, and sometimes families are able to contribute additional support. In other words, people who ran out of money were moved somewhere cheaper and less pleasant, or their families were expected to make up the difference. I thought about Marcus and Jesse, already stressed about the financial burden they believed I represented, suddenly being asked to contribute thousands of dollars a month to keep me in a place that would give them peace of mind about my care. I completed the tour and thanked Patricia for her time, assuring her that I would discuss everything with my family and get back to her soon. Then I sat in the parking lot for an hour, thinking about the conversation I needed to have with Marcus. He had called me a burden. Not intentionally cruel, but carelessly honest in a way that revealed exactly how he saw me and our relationship. I was a problem to be solved, a responsibility to be managed, an obligation that was interfering with his real life. But what if I wasn't any of those things? What if I was something else entirely? I drove home slowly, taking the long way through neighborhoods where I could have afforded to live but had chosen not to. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed Marcus's car was already there. He was sitting on my front porch, checking his phone with the impatient expression he wore when things weren't moving fast enough for his liking. "How did the tour go?" he asked as I walked up the front steps. "It was educational," I said, unlocking my front door. "Would you like some coffee? We need to talk." Marcus followed me into the kitchen, and I could sense his eagerness to hear that I had been impressed with Sunset Manor, that I was ready to admit he was right about my need for assisted living. "The facility seems very nice," I said, starting the coffee maker. "Professional staff, clean accommodations, reasonable security. So you can see why we think it would be a good fit for you?" I pulled 2 mugs from the cabinet and set them on the counter. "Marcus, before we discuss my living arrangements any further, I need to show you something." I left him in the kitchen and went to my bedroom, returning with the file box that contained my financial documents. I set it on the kitchen table between us and opened the lid. "What's all this?" he asked, looking at the folders and legal documents inside. "This," I said, pulling out the most recent portfolio statement, "is why your concern about how I would pay for assisted living is unnecessary." Marcus took the document and scanned the first page, his expression shifting from casual interest to confusion to something approaching shock. "Mom, what am I looking at here?" "You're looking at my investment portfolio. The current value is listed at the bottom of the page." He found the number and stared at it for a long moment. "This says $5.2 million. Yes. This can't be right. This has to be some kind of mistake." I pulled out additional statements, spreading them across the kitchen table like evidence in a trial. No mistake. Real estate holdings in Colorado, Arizona, and Oregon. Technology stocks, blue chip investments, municipal bonds, and a few more speculative ventures that paid off quite well. Marcus picked up document after document, his face growing paler with each revelation. "Mom, I don't understand. Where did all this money come from?" "I earned it," I said simply. "Over 40 years of careful investing, starting with a few $100s your father and I scraped together when you were a baby." "But you worked at the library. Dad worked construction. How could you possibly have accumulated this much wealth?" I poured coffee into both mugs and sat down across from him. "Marcus, what do you know about my work at the library?" "You were a librarian. You helped people find books and checked out materials. I was the head of research services for 25 years. I spent my days helping people find information, conducting complex research projects, and analyzing data. I became very good at research, including financial research. But still, even with good investments, how could you have turned a librarian's salary into millions of dollars?" I smiled, remembering the early days when Richard and I would stay up late analyzing annual reports and market trends by the light of our kitchen table lamp. "Do you remember when personal computers first became available to consumers? When everyone said they were too expensive and complicated for regular people?" "Vaguely. I researched the companies that were making them. I looked at their business models, their leadership, their potential for growth. And I bought stock in 3 companies that most people had never heard of. One of them was Microsoft." Marcus stared at me like I had just revealed that I was secretly a rocket scientist. "You bought Microsoft stock in the early 80s? "Among other things. I also invested in Apple, Amazon when it was just a bookstore, Google, before most people understood what a search engine was. I had access to information and research tools that most individual investors didn't have, and I used them." "And Dad knew about this?" "Of course your father knew. He wasn't interested in managing the investments himself, but he supported my research and decisions. He used to joke that he'd married the smartest woman in Colorado." Marcus rubbed his forehead, a gesture I recognized from his childhood. "Mom, if you have $5 million, why are you living like you're barely getting by?" Why do you drive a 15-year-old car and shop at discount stores and worry about the cost of groceries? It was the question I had been expecting, and I had been thinking about the answer for days. Because I learned very early that people treat you differently when they know you have money. They expect things from you. They make assumptions about what you should do with your resources. They stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as a solution to their own problems. But we're your family. We wouldn't have treated you differently. I looked at him directly. Wouldn't you have? If you had known I had millions of dollars, would you have spent the last year worrying about my ability to take care of myself? Would you have assumed I needed your help with my finances? Would you have called me a burden? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him processing not just the financial information but the implications of what I was telling him. You let me think you were struggling financially. I let you make assumptions about my financial situation. I never lied to you about money. But you never corrected my assumptions either. No, I didn't. Why are you telling me now? I gathered up the financial documents and placed them back in their folders. Because yesterday you called me a burden and told me I needed to be moved to assisted living so that you and Jesse could have your lives back. Because you spoke to me like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person deserving of respect. Marcus's face flushed with embarrassment and something that might have been shame. Mom, I didn't mean it the way it sounded. Yes, you did. And I understand why you felt that way, based on what you believed about my situation. But now you know the truth. Which is that I don't need your help, Marcus. I don't need your financial support, your worry, or your management of my life. I'm not a burden, and I never was. The silence that followed was heavy, with years of misunderstanding and miscommunication. I could see Marcus struggling to reconcile the mother he thought he knew with the woman sitting across from him. What happens now? He asked finally. Now, I said, we figure out how to have a relationship based on honesty instead of assumptions. And we talk about what it really means to be family. But I could see in his eyes that everything had changed between us, and I wasn't sure if it had changed for the better. 3 days passed in a strange silence before Marcus called me again. I spent those days going about my normal routine, tending my garden, volunteering at the senior center, making my weekly trip to the grocery store, but everything felt different now that the truth was out in the open. The weight of 40 years of secrecy had lifted from my shoulders, replaced by an uncertainty about what would come next. When my phone finally rang on Friday evening, I was in my kitchen preparing a simple dinner of soup and salad, the same modest meal I would have made regardless of the millions sitting in my investment accounts. Mom, Marcus said, his voice strained and formal. Jesse and I would like to come over tomorrow morning to talk. Of course. What time works for you? 10 o'clock, if that's convenient. The careful politeness in his tone told me everything I needed to know about how the past 3 days had affected him. Marcus was treating me like a stranger now, someone he needed to approach with caution rather than the casual assumption of authority he had displayed just a week earlier. That night, I lay awake thinking about the conversation we were about to have. I had revealed my financial situation to stop Marcus from seeing me as a burden, but I realized I had no idea what he would see me as instead. A liar? A manipulator? Someone who had deliberately made his life more difficult than it needed to be? The truth was more complicated than any of those labels, but I wasn't sure Marcus was ready to understand complexity. He had always preferred situations that fit neatly into categories he could understand and manage. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of October weather that made even familiar spaces feel somber and uncertain. I made coffee and set out pastries from the bakery down the street, then sat at my kitchen table waiting for my son and daughter-in-law to arrive. When they knocked at 10 o'clock sharp, I could see through the front window that both of them looked like they were approaching a difficult business meeting rather than a family conversation. Marcus wore his most formal, casual clothes, pressed slacks and a button-down shirt, while Jessie had chosen a conservative blouse and skirt combination that made her look like she was dressed for a job interview. "Good morning," I said, opening the door and stepping aside to let them in. "Thank you for coming." Jessie gave me a stiff hug that felt more obligatory than affectionate. In the 10 years she had been married to Marcus, we had developed a pleasant but superficial relationship based on shared concern for his well-being and careful avoidance of topics that might create conflict. She was a kindergarten teacher, soft-spoken and generally agreeable, but I could see tension in her posture that suggested our conversation was not going to follow our usual pattern of polite small talk. "How are you feeling, Eleanor?" she asked, using the formal version of my name that she reserved for serious occasions. "Marcus told me about your revelation the other day. I'm feeling relieved, actually," I said, leading them into the kitchen. "It's nice not to have to hide things anymore." Marcus and Jesse exchanged a look that suggested they had spent considerable time discussing this situation and had come to some kind of agreement about how to handle it. "Mom," Marcus said, settling into the same chair where he had delivered his ultimatum about assisted living just a week earlier, "we need to understand something. When you say you've been hiding your financial situation, what exactly do you mean?" I poured coffee for all three of us, noting that Marcus's hands were slightly unsteady as he accepted his mug. "I mean that for 40 years, I've maintained a modest lifestyle while building substantial wealth through investments. I never lied about money, but I also never volunteered information about my actual financial situation." "But you let us worry about you," Jessie said, her voice carrying a note of accusation that surprised me with its sharpness. "You let us think you were struggling to make ends meet on your pension." "Did I? When did I ever say I was struggling financially?" Marcus leaned forward, his expression intense. "Mom, you've spent years complaining about the cost of groceries, driving a car that's falling apart, shopping at discount stores. You've asked me to help you with financial paperwork and budgeting. How were we supposed to interpret that except as evidence that you were having money problems?" I sipped my coffee slowly, thinking about how to explain something that seemed perfectly logical to me, but apparently made no sense to them. "Marcus, I shop at discount stores because I don't like wasting money on overpriced items. I drive an older car because it's reliable and paid for. I comment on grocery prices because I think it's ridiculous how much they charge for basic necessities. None of those behaviors indicate financial distress." "What about asking for help with financial paperwork?" Jessie pressed. "I asked for help organizing my tax documents one time, because I had misplaced some receipts and thought you might have a better system for keeping track of paperwork. I never asked for help managing my finances." Marcus rubbed his temples, a gesture I recognized from his teenage years when he was frustrated by concepts he couldn't immediately grasp. "Mom, do you understand how this looks from our perspective? We've spent years thinking you needed our support and protection, and it turns out you've been secretly wealthy the entire time." "Not secretly wealthy," I corrected. "Privately wealthy. There's a difference." "Is there? Because from where I'm sitting, it feels like you've been lying to us for decades." The accusation stung, partly because there was some truth to it. I had been deliberately deceptive, not through outright lies, but through careful omissions and misdirections. I had allowed my family to believe things about my situation that weren't true because it served my desire for privacy and independence. "You're right," I said. "I have been deceptive. Not maliciously, but deceptive nonetheless. I wanted to maintain my privacy, and I was willing to let you make incorrect assumptions to preserve that privacy." "But why?" Jessie asked, and her voice carried genuine confusion rather than anger. "We're your family. Why wouldn't you want us to know you were successful and secure?" It was the question I had been asking myself for 3 days, and I still wasn't sure I had a complete answer. "Because I've watched what money does to family relationships. I've seen how it changes the way people interact with each other. I didn't want you to see me as a bank account instead of a person." "We would never have done that," Marcus protested. "Wouldn't you? If you had known I had millions of dollars, would our relationship have remained exactly the same? Would you have worried about my well-being the same way? Would you have treated me with the same casual familiarity?" Marcus and Jessie looked at each other again, and I could see them considering the question seriously for the first time. "Maybe not," Jessie admitted. "But that doesn't mean the change would have been negative. Maybe we would have respected your independence more. Maybe we would have worried less and trusted your judgment more. Or maybe you would have started asking me for loans. Maybe you would have expected me to pay for things. Maybe you would have resented me if I didn't want to share my wealth in ways you thought were appropriate." "That's a pretty cynical view of your own family," Marcus said. "It's a realistic view based on 40 years of observation. I've seen how money changes relationships, Marcus. I've watched families destroyed by inheritance disputes and lending disagreements. I've seen children who stop visiting their parents after being denied financial support. I didn't want that to happen to us. Marcus stood up and walked to my kitchen window, staring out at the backyard where he had played as a child. So instead, you let us think you were becoming a burden. You let us worry about your future and make plans to take care of you financially. I never asked you to take care of me financially. You didn't have to ask. That's what families do. When we thought you were living on a limited income, of course we were going to worry about your ability to afford healthcare and housing and all the expenses that come with aging. I joined him at the window, remembering all the times I had watched him build snow forts and climb the maple tree that now dominated our view. And that worry made you see me as a burden. Because we thought you were going to become our financial responsibility eventually. We thought we were going to have to help support you, and we were trying to prepare for that reality. And now that you know I don't need your financial support, Marcus turned to face me, his expression a mixture of relief and something that looked like disappointment. Now I don't know what to think. I don't know what our relationship is supposed to be if you don't actually need anything from us. The honesty of his response hit me harder than any accusation could have. My son had defined our relationship in terms of my neediness and his ability to meet those needs. Without that dynamic, he wasn't sure what was left between us. What would you like our relationship to be? I asked. I don't know, he said. I thought I was taking care of my aging mother. I thought I was being a good son by worrying about you and trying to make sure you had the support you needed. If you don't actually need support, then what am I supposed to do? Jessie had been listening to our exchange with growing distress. Marcus, she's still your mother. She still loves you. Having money doesn't change that. Doesn't it? Marcus looked at both of us. Because right now I feel like I don't know who she really is. The mother I thought I knew was struggling to get by and needed my help. This person is apparently some kind of financial genius who's been manipulating our perceptions for decades. I'm the same person I've always been, I said quietly. I just have more money than you realized. Are you? Because the mother I knew would have been honest with me about something this important. The conversation was spiraling into territory I hadn't anticipated. I had expected Marcus to be surprised, possibly hurt, maybe even angry about my deception. But I hadn't expected him to question my fundamental identity, or our entire relationship. Marcus, I said, what if I had told you about my investments 20 years ago? What would have been different? He considered the question seriously. I probably would have asked you for help when Jessie and I were struggling to buy our first house. I might have expected you to pay for the kids' expenses, or to help us with vacations or emergencies. And if I had said no, I would have been hurt. I would have wondered why you were hoarding money instead of helping your family. And our relationship would have become about money instead of about love. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him beginning to understand the impossible position I had been in. So you chose to let us think you were poor, rather than risk us asking you for money. I chose to maintain my privacy rather than turn my financial success into a family issue. Jessie had been listening to our conversation with increasing understanding. Eleanor, I think I see why you made the choice you did. But I also think you underestimated us. Maybe we would have asked for help sometimes, but that doesn't mean we would have stopped loving you if you said no. Maybe not, I acknowledged. But I wasn't willing to take that risk. And now? Marcus asked. What happens now that we know the truth? It was the question I had been dreading, because I still didn't have a good answer. Now we figure out how to move forward with honesty instead of assumptions. What does that look like? I walked back to the kitchen table and sat down, gesturing for them to join me. It looks like me being able to afford my own care as I age, without being a financial burden to you. It looks like you not having to worry about my security or independence. It looks like us having a relationship based on choice rather than obligation. But what about everything else? Jessie asked. What about the fact that you have enough money to make a real difference in people's lives? What about charitable giving or helping family members who are struggling? I had been wondering about this myself for the past 3 days. For 40 years, I had focused on building and preserving wealth, but I had never developed a clear philosophy about what to do with it. The money had become an end in itself rather than a means to accomplish something meaningful. I'm still figuring that out, I admitted. I've been so focused on keeping my wealth private that I've never really considered how to use it purposefully. Marcus leaned back in his chair, looking more relaxed than he had since arriving. Mom, can I ask you something? Of course. When you found out I thought you were a burden, how did that make you feel? I considered his question carefully. It made me feel invisible. Like you had stopped seeing me as a complete person and started seeing me only as a collection of problems to be solved. And when you decided to reveal your financial situation, what were you hoping would change? I was hoping you would see that I wasn't actually a burden, that I was capable of taking care of myself and making my own decisions about my life. Mission accomplished, Marcus said with a rueful smile. I definitely don't see you as a burden anymore. But you're not sure what you do see me as. Honestly, right now I see you as someone I don't know as well as I thought I did. Someone who's been living a much more complicated life than I realized. Jesse reached across the table and touched my hand. Eleanor, can I share something with you? Of course, dear. For the past year, Marcus and I have been lying awake at night worrying about what would happen when you needed more care. We've been stressed about money, about time, about our ability to take care of you properly. We felt guilty about resenting the responsibility, but we've also felt trapped by it. I squeezed her hand. I never wanted you to feel trapped. We know that now. But the relief we feel knowing that you can afford whatever care you need, that we don't have to choose between your well-being and our financial stability, it's enormous. Marcus nodded. It's like a weight has been lifted. But it's also made me realize how much of our relationship was built around my perception of your neediness. And now we get to build a relationship based on something else, I said. The question is what? What would you like it to be based on? Jesse asked. I thought about all the conversations Marcus and I had missed over the years, because he was focused on my limitations rather than my capabilities. All the times I had held back from sharing my thoughts and opinions because I was trying to maintain the image of someone who needed guidance, rather than someone who had wisdom to offer. I'd like it to be based on mutual respect, I said. I'd like you to see me as someone with valuable experience and insights, rather than someone who needs to be managed. I'd like to be able to share my thoughts about your lives and decisions, without you dismissing me as an elderly woman who doesn't understand the modern world. Have we done that? Marcus asked. Sometimes. When I've tried to offer advice about your careers or the children, you've often responded like, I don't understand how things work now. Like my perspective isn't relevant because I'm old and, presumably, out of touch. Marcus looked uncomfortable. I didn't realize I was doing that. I know. And I understand why you would assume that a retired librarian living on a pension wouldn't have much insight into financial planning or career development. But the reality is that I've been successfully managing complex investments for decades. I've probably learned things that could be useful to you. What kind of things? Jesse asked, leaning forward with interest. Well, for instance, you've mentioned wanting to buy a house in the Riverside Heights neighborhood but not being able to afford the down payment. Right. The houses there start at $400,000, and we'd need at least $80,000 for a down payment. On Marcus's real estate commissions and my teaching salary, it would take us years to save that much. What if you didn't have to save it? Marcus and Jesse looked at each other, and I could see the moment when they realized what I was suggesting. Mom, Marcus said carefully, are you offering to loan us money for a house? I'm suggesting that there might be ways to structure an arrangement that would help you achieve your housing goals without putting either of us in an uncomfortable position. What kind of arrangement? I've been thinking about this possibility for several days, ever since I realized that my secret wealth could actually be useful to my family if handled properly. I could purchase a property in the neighborhood you like and allow you to live in it while building equity through a rent-to-own agreement. You'd get the house you want without having to qualify for a large mortgage, and I'd get a stable investment property. Jesse's eyes widened. You could really do that? I could easily do that. The question is whether you'd be comfortable with that kind of arrangement. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him processing not just the financial opportunity, but the implications of accepting help from me. Would this be a loan or a gift? It would be a business arrangement. You'd pay fair market rent, and a portion of that rent would go toward building equity in the property. After a certain number of years, you'd have the option to purchase the house outright at a predetermined price. And if we decided we didn't want to buy it, then you'd move out, And I'd have an investment property that had been well maintained by tenants I trust. Jesse looked excited about the possibility, but Marcus still seemed hesitant. Mom, this feels like a huge favor. What would you want in return? I'd want you to stop seeing me as someone who needs to be managed, and start seeing me as someone who might occasionally have something valuable to contribute to your life. That's it. That's it. I want a relationship based on mutual respect, instead of one-sided caregiving. Marcus smiled for the first time since arriving. I think I can handle that. Good. Because I have some other ideas about ways my resources could be useful, if you're interested in hearing them. What kind of ideas? I pulled out a notebook where I had been jotting down thoughts over the past few days. College funds for the children that would cover not just tuition, but also living expenses and study abroad opportunities. A family vacation fund that would allow us to take trips together without anyone having to worry about the cost. Startup capital for business ventures you might want to pursue. Business ventures? Marcus asked. You've mentioned wanting to start your own real estate firm instead of working for someone else. That takes capital. I've thought about it, but the risk seemed too high with the kids and the mortgage to consider. What if the risk was lower? What if you had the financial cushion to try something entrepreneurial without worrying about losing your family's security? I could see the wheels turning in Marcus's mind as he considered possibilities that had seemed impossible just an hour earlier. Mom, he said slowly, this changes everything. It changes everything if we let it. Or it changes nothing if we decide to keep things the way they are. What do you want to change? I looked at my son and daughter-in-law, these two people I loved, who had been carrying burdens I could have easily lifted if I had been willing to share my secret earlier. I want to stop pretending I'm someone I'm not. I want to use my resources in ways that make life better for people I care about. And I want to have the kind of relationship with you that's based on who we really are, rather than who we've been pretending to be. Jesse reached across the table and took both of our hands. I think that sounds wonderful. Marcus squeezed my hand. I'm sorry I called you a burden, Mom. I was wrong about a lot of things. You weren't wrong to worry about me. You were wrong to assume I couldn't take care of myself. And I'm sorry I made you feel like you had to hide who you really are. You didn't make me hide anything. I chose to hide because I was afraid of how money might change our relationship. But maybe it's time to find out if our relationship is strong enough to handle the truth. I think it is, Marcus said. I hope it is. There's only one way to find out. That afternoon, after Marcus and Jesse left, I sat in my garden thinking about the conversation we had just had. For the first time in 40 years, I had been completely honest with my family about my financial situation. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the uncertainty about what came next. I pulled out my phone and called Margaret Walsh, my financial advisor. Eleanor, she said when she answered, how did the conversation with your son go? Better than I expected, actually. Margaret, I need to ask you about setting up some family trusts and investment accounts. What kind of accounts? The kind that would allow me to help my family without creating dependency or resentment. Ah, Margaret said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. Now we're talking about the fun part of wealth management. Is that what this is? Fun. Eleanor, you've spent 40 years building something remarkable. Now you get to decide what to do with it. If that's not fun, I don't know what is. I looked around at my modest house and garden, thinking about all the ways my life was about to change. Margaret, I'm going to need your help figuring out how to be wealthy in public instead of wealthy in secret. I think you're going to be very good at it. What makes you say that? Because you've already proven you're smart enough to build wealth without letting it corrupt you. Now you just have to learn how to use it without letting it corrupt your relationships. Any advice on how to do that? Start slowly. Set clear boundaries. Remember that money is a tool, not a weapon. And don't let anyone, including family members, make you feel guilty for having resources or for choosing how to use them. That evening, I made myself dinner and ate it at my kitchen table while reading through investment portfolios and thinking about the future. For the first time in decades, I was planning to spend significant amounts of money instead of just accumulating it. The prospect was both exciting and terrifying. I had become so comfortable with my secret wealth that I wasn't sure how to handle having it be visible. But I was tired of being seen as less than I was, and I was ready to find out what kind of relationships were possible when people knew the whole truth about who I was. The next morning, I called Marcus. "Hi, Mom," he said, and his voice was warmer than it had been in months. "How are you feeling today?" "Like someone who's ready to stop being a burden and start being a blessing," I said. "I like the sound of that." "Good. Because I have some phone calls to make, and I'm going to need your help with something." "What kind of help?" "The kind that involves telling people the truth about your mother for the first time in 40 years. "I think I can handle that." "We'll see," I said, smiling as I hung up the phone and reached for my list of people who were about to learn that Eleanor Whitmore was not exactly who they thought she was. 2 weeks after my revelation to Marcus, I found myself standing in the lobby of Riverside Community Bank, waiting to meet with the branch manager about opening a charitable foundation account. The woman behind the desk looked up at me with the polite but slightly condescending smile that bank employees typically reserved for elderly customers they assumed were there to discuss small pension deposits or minor account issues. "Mrs. Whitmore?" she said, checking her appointment book. "I'm Patricia Henderson, the branch manager. You mentioned wanting to discuss establishing a foundation account?" "Yes," I said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "I'd like to set up a charitable foundation with an initial funding of $1 million. Patricia's professional smile faltered slightly. "I'm sorry, did you say $1 million? "Yes, for starters." The transformation in her demeanor was immediate and complete. Suddenly, I was no longer a typical elderly customer to be handled efficiently and politely dismissed. I was someone worthy of her full attention, her expertise, and her enthusiasm for complicated financial arrangements. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, pulling out forms and documents with considerably more energy than she had displayed moments earlier. "Let me get our private wealth management specialist involved in this conversation. This is exactly the kind of account we love to facilitate." I spent the next 2 hours in meetings with various bank officials, all of whom seemed genuinely excited about helping me establish what I had decided to call the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation for Community Support. The foundation would focus on 3 areas: educational opportunities for low-income students, healthcare assistance for seniors who couldn't afford medical expenses, and small business loans for local entrepreneurs who couldn't qualify for traditional bank financing. By the time I left the bank, I had established the foundation, appointed myself as the primary trustee, and designated Marcus as my successor in case anything happened to me. I had also scheduled meetings with local organizations to identify specific needs the foundation could address. The drive home gave me time to process what I had just done. For the first time in 40 years, I had made a major financial decision that couldn't be hidden or minimized. By tomorrow, people throughout Riverside would know that Eleanor Whitmore had the resources to fund significant charitable activities. My secret was officially over. The next morning, I was in my kitchen making coffee when Mrs. Chen knocked on my front door. Through the window, I could see her clutching a newspaper and looking more agitated than I had ever seen her. "Eleanor," she said when I opened the door, "have you seen the morning paper?" She thrust the Riverside Daily News toward me, opened to a page featuring a photograph of me shaking hands with Patricia Henderson at the bank. The headline read, "Local Librarian Establishes $1 Million Foundation." The article went on to describe my charitable foundation and included quotes from bank officials about my significant philanthropic commitment to the community. "Is this real?" Mrs. Chen asked, her voice a mixture of disbelief and excitement. "You really have $1 million to give away?" "I really do," I said, inviting her inside for coffee. "Actually, I have quite a bit more than that." Mrs. Chen sat down at my kitchen table and stared at me like I had just revealed that I was secretly a famous movie star. "Eleanor, I've known you for 15 years. You shop at the same discount grocery store I do. You drive a car older than my grandchildren. How do you have millions of dollars?" I poured coffee for both of us and sat down across from her. "I've been investing in the stock market for 40 years, Mrs. Chen. Very successfully, it turns out. But why didn't you ever say anything? All these years I've been worrying about you living on just your pension, and you've been rich the whole time." It was a question I had been answering repeatedly over the past 2 weeks, as word of my financial situation spread through my family and close friends. Each conversation was different, but the underlying theme was always the same. People felt deceived by my failure to reveal my wealth earlier. I kept my investments private because I wanted to live my life without other people's expectations about what I should do with my money, I explained. I've seen how wealth can change relationships, and I wasn't ready for that kind of change. But Eleanor, if you had told me you had money, I wouldn't have worried so much about you. Last winter, when you were sick with pneumonia, I was bringing you soup every day because I thought you couldn't afford to order food delivery. I remembered Mrs. Chen's kindness during my illness, how she had insisted on checking on me multiple times a day and bringing me homemade meals. Her concern had been genuine and touching, but it had also been based on assumptions about my circumstances that weren't accurate. Your kindness meant a lot to me, I said. But it would have meant just as much if you had known I could afford my own soup. Would it? Because now I feel foolish for thinking you needed my help. Mrs. Chen, I did need your help. I needed your friendship and your caring. Having money doesn't make someone less in need of human connection and kindness. She sipped her coffee thoughtfully. I suppose that's true, but it does make me wonder what else I don't know about you. Nothing important, I assured her. I'm the same person I've always been. I just have more money than you realized. And now you're giving it away. Some of it. I'm using it to help people in our community who could benefit from financial assistance. Mrs. Chen leaned forward with interest. What kind of assistance? Educational scholarships, medical expense support, small business, loans. Things that could make a real difference in people's lives. Could it help with prescription costs? She asked quietly. Because I know several people in our neighborhood who are rationing their medications because they can't afford the full prescriptions. This was exactly the kind of conversation I had been hoping to have. Yes, it could definitely help with prescription costs. Do you know specific people who are struggling with medication expenses? My friend Rosa Martinez hasn't been taking her blood pressure medication regularly because she can only afford to fill the prescription every other month. And Mr. Thompson down the street is trying to manage his diabetes without some of his medications because they're not covered by his insurance. Would you be comfortable introducing me to them? I'd like to find out if the foundation could help. Mrs. Chen's face lit up with excitement. You would really do that? Just like that? Mrs. Chen, this is exactly why I established the foundation. I want to help people in our community who are struggling with expenses they can't manage on their own. That afternoon, Mrs. Chen and I visited Rosa Martinez, a woman in her 60s who lived alone and was trying to manage multiple health conditions on a fixed income. Rosa was initially suspicious of my offer to help with her prescription costs, convinced there had to be some kind of catch or requirement that would make her assistance conditional. Mrs. Whitmore, she said, I appreciate the offer, but I don't understand why a stranger would want to pay for my medications. I'm not a stranger, I said. We live in the same community, we shop at the same stores, we face many of the same challenges. The only difference is that I've been fortunate enough to accumulate some resources, and I'd like to use them to help neighbors who could benefit from assistance. But what do I have to do in return? Nothing. You take your medications as prescribed by your doctor, and the foundation covers the costs your insurance doesn't pay. Rosa looked at Mrs. Chen for confirmation that this was really as simple as it sounded. There's no application process, no investigation into my finances, no requirements about how I spend the rest of my money? No requirements at all, I said. I just need your pharmacy information so I can set up an account to cover your prescription costs. Rosa started crying then, not from sadness but from relief. Do you know what it's like to have to choose between blood pressure medication and groceries? To know that you're risking a stroke because you can't afford the pills that would prevent it? I didn't know what that was like personally, but I had learned enough about the struggles of people in my community to understand how devastating those choices could be. You don't have to make those choices anymore. Word of my foundation's activities spread quickly through Riverside. Within a week, I was receiving phone calls from people throughout the community who had heard about my assistance to Rosa and Mr. Thompson and wanted to know if I might be able to help with their own financial challenges. Each conversation was different, but the pattern was consistent. People who had been struggling silently with expenses they couldn't manage, afraid to ask for help because they didn't want to be seen as charity cases, or burdens to their families. Maria Santos called about her daughter's college tuition. She had been working 2 jobs to try to cover the costs, but even with financial aid, the family was falling behind on payments, and her daughter was considering dropping out. "Mrs. Whitmore," Maria said, "I heard you're helping people with education expenses. Is that something that might include college tuition?" "It could," I said. "Tell me about your daughter's situation." "She's studying to be a nurse at Riverside Community College. She's a good student, she's working part-time to help with expenses, but even with grants and student loans, we're short about $3,000 per semester. I've been trying to make up the difference, but I'm falling behind on our other bills." "What's your daughter's name?" "Carmen. She's 19, and she's wanted to be a nurse since she was little. She volunteers at the senior center and works with elderly patients who love her. She'd be a wonderful nurse if she can finish school." I scheduled a meeting with Carmen and her mother for the following day. Carmen turned out to be a poised young woman who spoke passionately about her career goals and her desire to work with elderly patients in long-term care facilities. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "I know my mom talked to you about our financial situation. I want you to know that I'm not looking for a handout. I'm willing to work for any assistance you might provide. What kind of work did you have in mind?" "I could volunteer with your foundation, helping other students navigate college financial aid applications. I could work with elderly people in the community who might need assistance with healthcare-related paperwork. I could tutor other students who are struggling with their nursing classes." I was impressed by Carmen's initiative and her understanding that assistance didn't have to be one-sided. "Carmen, what if I told you that the foundation would cover your remaining tuition costs for the rest of your nursing program, with the understanding that after you graduate, you'll spend at least 2 years working with elderly patients in our community?" Carmen's eyes filled with tears. "You would do that?" "I would do that. We need good nurses in Riverside, especially nurses who are committed to working with senior citizens. Consider it an investment in our community's healthcare future." Carmen hugged both me and her mother, crying and laughing at the same time. I can't believe this is really happening. Over the following weeks, I found myself busier than I had been in years, meeting with people throughout Riverside who could benefit from foundation assistance. Each story was different, but they all shared common themes. People working hard to improve their circumstances but struggling with expenses that were just beyond their reach. James Wilson wanted to start a landscaping business but couldn't afford the equipment he needed to get started. The foundation provided a small business loan that allowed him to purchase a truck and professional lawn care equipment. Patricia Miller was a single mother trying to finish her nursing degree while working part-time and caring for her 2 young children. The foundation covered her childcare costs during her clinical rotations, allowing her to complete her program without having to choose between her education and her children's care. Robert Chen, Mrs. Chen's nephew, had been accepted to a prestigious engineering program but couldn't afford the costs associated with studying abroad for a semester. The foundation covered his international education expenses, giving him opportunities that would have been impossible otherwise. Each person I helped brought me stories of others who could benefit from assistance, creating a network of community support that extended far beyond what I had initially imagined. I began to understand that my wealth wasn't just a personal asset, but a community resource that could create ripple effects of positive change throughout Riverside. But the most meaningful conversation I had during this period was with Marcus, who called me 3 weeks after our initial revelation to tell me about a conversation he had had with his real estate colleagues. "Mom," he said, "I told some of the guys at work about your foundation, and it turns out that several of them know people who could benefit from your programs." "What kind of people?" "Single mothers trying to buy their first homes but struggling with down payment requirements. Elderly people who want to downsize but can't afford the costs associated with moving. Young families who are qualified for mortgages but need help with closing costs. And you're thinking the foundation could help with housing-related expenses? I'm thinking you could expand your foundation to include housing assistance. There's a real need in Riverside for programs that help people achieve stable housing situations." I was struck by the enthusiasm in Marcus's voice. For the first time since I had known him as an adult, he was talking to me about a project we could work on together, rather than a problem he needed to solve for me. "Would you be interested in helping me develop housing assistance programs?" I asked. "I'd love to help. I know the real estate market in Riverside, I understand the challenges people face when they're trying to buy homes, and I have connections with lenders and realtors who could help make these programs successful. It sounds like you're thinking about this as a business opportunity. I'm thinking about it as an opportunity to do something meaningful with my knowledge and experience. And yes, if the foundation needs someone to manage housing-related programs, I'd be interested in that position. I smiled, recognizing that my son was offering to work with me rather than for me or in spite of me. Marcus, how would you feel about leaving your current job to work full-time for the foundation? Are you serious? I'm completely serious. I need someone I trust to help manage the foundation's programs, and you have the skills and community connections to make our housing assistance programs successful. Mom, that would be incredible. I've been wanting to do something more meaningful with my career, but I've never been able to take the financial risk of leaving my current job. Now you can take that risk. What would you want your role to be? I'd want to be the foundation's Director of Community Development. I'd identify needs in Riverside that could be addressed through foundation programs, develop partnerships with local organizations, and manage the implementation of assistance programs. That sounds perfect. When could you start? Are you really offering me a job working for your foundation? I'm offering you the opportunity to help me use my resources to make a real difference in our community. It would be a partnership, Marcus. We'd be working together to accomplish something important. I can't believe this is happening, he said, and I could hear the excitement in his voice. 6 months ago, I thought you were a burden I needed to take care of. Now you're offering me the opportunity to do the most meaningful work of my career. That's what happens when people see each other clearly, I said. When you saw me as someone who needed care, that's the relationship we had. Now that you see me as someone with resources and capabilities, we can have a completely different kind of relationship. What kind of relationship? The kind where we're partners working towards shared goals instead of caregiver and patient. That afternoon, I called Margaret Walsh to discuss the legal and financial arrangements necessary to formalize Marcus's role with the foundation and to establish the expanded programs we had discussed. Eleanor, Margaret said, it sounds like you're really hitting your stride with this philanthropy work. I am. For the first time in 40 years, I'm using my money in ways that feel meaningful and purposeful. How does it feel to be publicly wealthy instead of secretly wealthy? Scary and exhilarating at the same time. I've had to learn how to say no to people who ask for assistance that doesn't fit within the foundation's mission. I've had to establish boundaries around my personal finances versus foundation funds. I've had to figure out how to be generous without being taken advantage of. Those are all skills that wealthy people have to develop. You're just learning them later than most. What's interesting is how different people respond to my wealth now that it's visible. Some people treat me with more respect, like my opinions matter more because I have money. Other people are suspicious of my motives, like they assume I must want something in return for my generosity. Both of those responses are normal. The key is to stay focused on your own goals and values, rather than trying to manage other people's reactions. That's what I'm trying to do. Some days are easier than others. Eleanor, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you regret keeping your wealth secret for so long? I thought about Margaret's question for several days before I had a clear answer. I was sitting in my garden on a Saturday morning, watching Mrs. Chen and Rosa Martinez plant flowers they had purchased with money they no longer had to spend on prescription medications, when I realized how I felt about my decades of secrecy. The regret I felt wasn't about keeping my wealth private, but about allowing that privacy to create distance between me and the people I cared about. I regretted letting Marcus see me as a burden instead of finding ways to show him my capabilities without revealing my entire financial situation. I regretted not helping neighbors like Rosa and Mr. Thompson years earlier when I could have easily made their lives less stressful. I regretted missing opportunities to use my resources for meaningful purposes because I was so focused on protecting my privacy. But I didn't regret the careful, disciplined approach I had taken to building wealth. I didn't regret learning to live modestly and find satisfaction in simple pleasures. I didn't regret the independence and security that my investments had provided. The Eleanor Whitmore who had revealed her wealth was fundamentally the same person who had hidden it for 40 years. The difference was that now I was using my resources in alignment with my values instead of just accumulating them out of habit and fear. 6 months after my initial conversation with Marcus about assisted living, I found myself back in the parking lot of Sunset Manor. But this time, I wasn't there as a potential resident. I was there as a donor, meeting with the facility's administrators to discuss a partnership with my foundation. "Mrs. Whitmore," said Janet Morrison, the facility's director, "we're honored that you're considering Sunset Manor for your foundation's senior care initiatives. I'm interested in funding programs that would allow people to receive high-quality care regardless of their ability to pay the full costs," I said. "What would that look like at Sunset Manor?" "We could establish a fund that would subsidize care for residents whose families can't afford our full rates. We could also fund additional services, like physical therapy, mental health counseling, and social activities that aren't covered by standard care packages." How many people in Riverside are currently unable to access quality senior care because of financial constraints? More than you might think. We have a waiting list of people who would benefit from our services but can't afford them, and we know that many families are providing care at home because they can't afford assisted living options. I thought about Marcus's original concern that I would become a financial burden to him and Jesse. The irony was striking. He had been worried about costs I could easily afford, while other families in our community were struggling with expenses that represented genuine hardships. "I'd like to establish a permanent endowment that would provide ongoing support for low-income seniors who need assisted living services," I said. "What would be required to set up that kind of program?" "For a significant impact, we'd be looking at an endowment in the range of $2 to $3 million. That would generate enough annual income to subsidize care for approximately 30 residents at any given time." "Let's make it $3 million, I said. "I want to make sure the program can help as many people as possible." Janet's professional composure slipped slightly. "Mrs. Whitmore, did you just commit to a $3 million endowment?" "I did. When can we start implementing the program?" That evening, I called Marcus to tell him about my meeting at Sunset Manor. "Mom," he said, "you just committed $3 million to subsidize senior care?" "I did. It feels like the right way to address the concerns you raised about aging and independence. Instead of worrying about being a burden to you, I can help ensure that other families don't have to face those same worries." "That's incredible. Do you realize what you've accomplished in just 6 months?" "What do you mean?" "You've established a foundation that's helping dozens of people in our community. You've created educational opportunities, healthcare assistance, housing support, and now senior care programs. You've basically become Riverside's most significant philanthropist. I've become someone who's using her resources purposefully instead of just accumulating them. And you've shown me what's possible when someone combines financial resources with genuine concern for community welfare." "Marcus, can I ask you something?" "Of course. When you called me a burden 6 months ago, what did you think my future looked like?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I thought you were going to become increasingly dependent on me and Jesse. I thought we were going to be responsible for managing your finances, your healthcare, your housing, your daily needs. I was scared about our ability to handle that responsibility while also taking care of our own family. And now? Now I see that you're more capable of taking care of yourself than I am of taking care of myself. I see that you have the resources to age with dignity and independence. I see that instead of being a burden to our family, you're a blessing to our entire community. What changed your perspective? Learning who you really are instead of making assumptions based on what I thought I knew. And how do you feel about our relationship now?" "I feel like I finally have a mother who's a partner instead of a patient. I feel like we're working together to accomplish meaningful things instead of me trying to manage your limitations." "Marcus, I need to tell you something important." "What's that?" "I love you more now than I have in years. Because you finally see me as I really am, instead of as someone who needs to be managed." "I love you too, Mom. And I'm proud of what you've built and what you're doing with it." A year after my revelation to Marcus, I was featured on the front page of the Riverside Daily News again. This time the headline read, "Local Philanthropist's Foundation Marks First Anniversary with $1 Million Community Impact." The article detailed the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation's accomplishments: 47 college scholarships awarded, medical expenses covered for 83 community members, small business loans provided to 12 local entrepreneurs, housing assistance given to 31 families, and ongoing support established for senior care services. But the statistic that meant the most to me wasn't mentioned in the newspaper. Over the course of the year, I had received thank you notes from 215 people whose lives had been positively affected by foundation programs. Each note represented someone who no longer had to choose between basic necessities. Someone who could pursue educational or business opportunities that had previously been out of reach. Someone who could age with dignity instead of fear. More importantly, each note represented a relationship based on mutual respect rather than dependency. The people who benefited from foundation programs weren't recipients of charity but partners in community building. They contributed their skills, knowledge, and energy to help other community members, creating networks of support that extended far beyond financial assistance. I had learned that wealth was most powerful when it was used to help people become more capable and independent rather than more dependent. The Foundation's programs were designed to give people tools and opportunities they could use to improve their own circumstances, not to create ongoing dependence on external support. Marcus had turned out to be an exceptional director of community development, bringing creativity and energy to foundation programs that I never could have imagined when I was managing my wealth in secret. His real estate expertise had allowed us to develop innovative housing assistance programs, and his community connections had helped us identify needs and opportunities throughout Riverside. But perhaps most importantly, working together on foundation projects had given us a relationship based on shared goals and mutual respect. Instead of seeing me as his aging mother who needed care, Marcus saw me as his partner in meaningful work. Instead of seeing him as someone who was burdened by my needs, I saw him as someone who brought valuable skills and insights to projects we both cared about. On the evening of the Foundation's first anniversary, Marcus and I sat in my garden talking about plans for the coming year. "Mom," he said, "what do you think Dad would say about what you've accomplished?" I thought about Richard, who had supported my early investment activities but had never lived to see the full extent of what we had built together. I think he'd be proud. But I also think he'd say that the money was never the point. What was the point? The point was building something that would outlast us. Creating opportunities for other people to build better lives. Using whatever resources we had to make our community stronger and more supportive. Do you think you'll keep expanding the Foundation's programs? As long as there are needs in our community that we can address, yes. But I'm also thinking about sustainability. I want to make sure the Foundation can continue its work, even after I'm no longer able to manage it. What does that look like? It looks like training other people to take leadership roles in foundation programs. It looks like establishing permanent endowments that will generate ongoing income for community support. It looks like creating systems and partnerships that don't depend on any single person's involvement. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. It sounds like you're thinking about legacy. I'm thinking about impact. I want the Foundation's work to continue making a difference in people's lives long after I'm gone. Mom, can I tell you something? Of course. A year ago, when I called you a burden, I was thinking about legacy too. I was worried that taking care of you would prevent me from building something meaningful with my own life. And now? Now I realize that helping you use your resources to strengthen our community is the most meaningful work I've ever done. This foundation isn't just your legacy, it's mine too. What do you mean? I mean that years from now, when people talk about the impact the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation had on Riverside, they'll also be talking about work that I contributed to. They'll be talking about programs that I helped develop and implement. This foundation is creating a legacy for both of us. I smiled, thinking about how completely our relationship had transformed over the past year. Marcus, do you remember what you said about wanting your life back? I remember. Do you feel like you got your life back? I feel like I got a better life than I ever imagined possible. Working with the Foundation has given me purpose and meaning that I never had when I was just selling real estate. Our relationship is stronger than it's ever been. I'm proud of what we're accomplishing together. And you don't see me as a burden anymore? Marcus laughed. Mom, you're the opposite of a burden. You're someone who's given me the opportunity to do work that matters. You're someone who's trusted me with significant responsibility and shown confidence in my abilities. You're someone who's made it possible for me to have a positive impact on other people's lives. What am I then if I'm not a burden? You're my partner. You're my mother. You're someone I respect and admire. You're someone who's taught me that it's never too late to reinvent yourself and find new ways to make a difference. That night, I sat in my bedroom looking through the thank you notes I had received from Foundation Program participants over the past year. Each note told a story of someone whose life had been improved by having access to resources they couldn't have obtained on their own. But the notes also told stories of people who had used Foundation assistance to become more independent and capable, not more dependent. Carmen Santos had graduated from nursing school and was now working with elderly patients at Riverside General Hospital. James Wilson's landscaping business was thriving, and he had hired 3 other community members as employees. Patricia Miller had completed her nursing degree and was working in the pediatric unit at the community hospital. Each person who had benefited from Foundation programs was now contributing to the community in ways that created positive ripple effects for other people. The Foundation's initial investments were generating ongoing returns in the form of stronger community networks, better local services, and increased opportunities for other residents. I had learned that the most effective philanthropy wasn't about giving money away, but about investing in people's potential to create positive change in their own lives and communities. The Foundation's programs were designed to help people become more capable and independent, not to create ongoing dependency on external support. But I had also learned that wealth was most meaningful when it was shared with people who understood its purpose and potential. My secret wealth had been secure but sterile. My public wealth was riskier but infinitely more rewarding, because it was connected to relationships and community impact. The Eleanor Whitmore Foundation had become more than a charitable organization. It had become a vehicle for building the kind of community I wanted to live in, a place where people supported each other's goals and dreams, where financial resources were used to create opportunities rather than dependencies, where aging could be a time of contribution and growth rather than decline and burden. Marcus had been right to worry about his mother becoming a burden, but he had been wrong about which mother he was worried about. The Eleanor who hid her wealth and capabilities had been in danger of becoming exactly the kind of burden he feared. The Eleanor who used her wealth openly and purposefully had become someone who lightened other people's burdens instead of adding to them. Standing in my garden on that anniversary evening, surrounded by flowers that Mrs. Chen and Rosa Martinez had planted with money they no longer had to spend on prescription medications, I realized that I had finally learned the difference between being wealthy and being rich. Being wealthy meant having financial resources. Being rich meant using those resources to create abundance for other people. For 40 years, I had been wealthy. For the past year, I had been rich. And being rich, I had discovered, was infinitely more satisfying than being secretly wealthy had ever been. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.